to day 14 of 15 days to Spring Boot Mastery Challenge. In today's challenge, let us learn to authenticate our Spring REST API. Let us get started. These are the topics that we will be discussing in this video. The key terms that are used in Spring Security, Spring Security Architecture, a simple example to authenticate the Spring REST API using basic authentication. What are the key terms that are used with Spring Security? They are authentication, authorization, principal, role, authority. What is authentication? Authentication refers to the process of verifying the user's identity to check whether they have the right credentials to access a particular resource or perform an action. Let me put this in simple terms. If I have to enter into a company in a tech park, it is mandatory that I need to have an ID card. Only then I will be authenticated or allowed to enter into their premises. This is authentication. Okay. What is authorization? This refers to the process of checking if the user has the right permission or privileges to access a particular resource and perform an action. Now, let me explain this with a simple example. Assume I am having a website. I am an admin of a particular website. In that case, I can perform CRUD operations with the database. That is, I can add a product to the database, update a product in the database, and also I have the privilege of deleting an object based on ID. This is because I have the role as admin. But if I am an end user of that application, I can only view the products that are available in that website. So, authorization goes hands on hand with role. Based on the role, the user will have the permission or privileges or right to access a particular resource and perform an action. Let me explain you with another example. As a customer, when I go to a bank, my access is limited only till a particular point. I cannot enter into the clerical cabin. I cannot enter into the cashier's cabin because my role here is customer. But a bank manager who has the role as manager has access to all the parts of the bank. Similar to this, a person who has the role as clerk has only limited access. He cannot enter into cashier's cabin. So based on the role, the authorization is determined. The user has permissions or rights or privileges to access a particular resource and perform an action based on the role only. This is called as authorization. Principal. What is principal? Principal refers to the currently logged in user. Say for example, there is an application. To enter into that application, I am supposed to provide my credentials, either the username and password or email and password. Once my credentials are checked with the database, if the credentials are matching, this means I am an authenticated user. This means I am logged into this application. What next? What is role? Role refers to the user's higher level roles in a system. If we take, say for example, in a showroom, there are different people with different roles. As in, there can be a store manager, a cashier, a customer care person, a sales person, a housekeeping person, and a stock manager, and so on. Based on the role, they are allowed to access that particular resources. Next, what is authority? Authority refers to the permission or privileges or rights that are provided to a user to access a particular resource. What is the difference between role and authority? Role is coarse-grained. It is a higher level. The user can have the role as customer, admin, store manager, manager, delivery, and so on. Then what is authority? Authority is fine-grained. Authority is the permission that is given to a user to perform certain tasks. Let me explain this with simple example. A user with the role as manager will have all the authorities, all the privileges, read privileges, write privileges, delete privileges. Similar to this, a user with the role as store manager will have privileges specific to his storeroom. Maybe he is having only write privileges and read privileges, no delete privileges option. So, this authority refers to the privileges given to a user to perform a task. These are the 5 terms that you need to know in Spring Security. Authentication, which refers to the process of verifying the user's identity to check whether he is having the right credentials to enter into the application, just like an ID card. Authorization. Authorization is the process of checking whether the user has the rights and permission to access a particular resource and perform a task. As in, the role can be an admin or customer. If the role is admin, he can perform tasks relevant to database. If the role is customer, he can just view the items that are available in the application. Principal refers to the currently logged in user who is already authenticated. Role refers to the user's higher level role in a system. Example is customer, admin, manager, store manager, cashier, delivery, salesperson, and so on. Authority. This refers to the permission or rights or privileges that are given to the user to access a resource and perform an action. Now I hope this is clear. We will move on to Spring Security Architecture. Okay, guys, now let us get an understanding of Spring Security Architecture. Already we have learned about Spring MVC architecture. So this is the pictorial representation of MVC architecture. A request comes from the client and it enters into the server. Whatever request is coming in is taken by dispatcher servlet. This dispatcher servlet is also called as front controller. This dispatcher servlet is responsible for sending the request to the appropriate controller class. Suppose if I am having the URL as /login, the dispatcher servlet should identify a controller class that is having a method with the URL as /login. It identifies the appropriate controller using handler mapping classes. If you are working in a web application, the dispatcher servlet will go in search of a class that is annotated with @controller. If you are working with REST API, the dispatcher servlet will go in search of a class that is annotated with @REST-controller. Once the work is done, the result will be returned back to the dispatcher servlet. The dispatcher servlet will return the result as a response. This is what we have seen in an MVC architecture. Guys, while working with MVC architecture, I showed the pictorial representation in a horizontal format. Now I am showing it in a vertical format. That is the only difference. Now, please understand, whenever you are working in a web application, it uses the HTTP Servlet API. Whenever you are working with a web application using JEE spec, Java Enterprise Edition spec, in that case, it uses Servlet API. Whatever request is coming in, it has to go through different types of filters. Filter 1, 2, filter 2, filter 3, like that till filter n. So, the request has to pass through all these filters before it enters into the dispatcher servlet. What is the purpose of these filters? These filters are responsible for filtering the user based on certain condition. Maybe these filters can be used for authenticating a user or logging the details that is coming from the client side or compressing and sending the data to the dispatcher servlet. In case of web application, all these filters are registered to servlet container. If you have worked in a JSP servlet application, you might be knowing that whenever you are creating a filter, you have to register the filter using an XML file or using annotation. Now we are working with Spring Security module. In this case, we are using IOC container. Now we need to bridge the gap between the servlet container and the IOC container. For this purpose, the Spring Security module introduced a filter implementation class which is delegating filter proxy. This delegating filter proxy acts as a bridge between the servlet container and our application context, that is the IOC container. So, this particular class, delegating filter proxy, also registers itself to the servlet container. This delegating filter proxy class does not handle the request by itself. Rather, it will delegate the request to a special class that implements filter. This class is filter proxy chain. This is a special filter from Spring Security. This filter again in turn delegates a request to multiple filter chains using another class called as security filter chain. Now this security filter chain has multiple filters within itself. I hope you can understand. Let me explain this whole process again. In a web application, whatever request is coming in, they have to cross through multiple filters before entering into the dispatcher servlet. All these filters that are created automatically register themselves to the servlet container. If you are working with Tomcat, they will register themselves to the Apache servlet container. Now, in our case, we are working with Spring Security module. So, in Spring Security, there is a special class called as Delegating Filter Proxy, which behaves like a bridge between the servlet container and the IOC container. The Delegating Filter Proxy also registers itself to the servlet container. Now, whatever request has to come in will come into Delegating Filter Proxy. It will not perform the filtering operation. Rather, it will delegate the request to another special class that implements filter. This class is called as filter proxy chain. This is a special filter provided by Spring Security module. Again, this class will not perform the filtering operation. Rather, it will delegate the request to multiple filter chains through an instance of security filter chain. This class cannot connect to the filter chain directly. It will send the request to security filter chain. The security filter chain is responsible for filtering the request in a proper order and send the final request to dispatcher servlet. This is the flow of Spring Security module. Okay, what happens internally? That is actually a very big process. There is an inbuilt interface called as Authentication. Whatever data comes to this interface is nothing but the credentials. That is your username and password, or email and password, or any other format which are behaving as credentials. Now, internally this authentication interface has to use an authentication manager to perform the authentication. Under the security filter chain, there are so many filters. One such filter is responsible for performing the authentication. Whatever request comes to this authentication filter is the credentials of the user. It can be in any form, username and password, or email and password, or any other form which behave like credentials. The authentication interface will send the data to an authentication manager. This authentication manager will pick and choose one particular type to perform the authentication. Guys, that part is completely intense, so I am not going into that detailed part. Now understand, this authentication manager is responsible for performing the authentication. Once the credentials are correct, the authentication manager will return the authenticated user, that is the currently logged in user, which is also called as the principal. So that is the work of this particular filter. Once the user is authenticated, the request will be automatically given to the dispatcher servlet. The dispatcher servlet will now continue with the flow of identifying the appropriate controller. Okay, so I hope this part is clear. Now let us move on to understanding about and the different ways of authenticating a Spring application. These are the different ways in which you can authenticate your Spring REST API. First one, basic authentication by Spring. Whenever you are creating a REST API, it is mandatory that you need to add Spring Security module. The moment you add Spring Security module, auto configuration pumps in. In this case, if you are not providing any configuration details for authenticating your application, Spring Security module will automatically create a username with the name user and auto-generate a password. This means Spring Framework is automatically coming up with certain credentials. The username will be user, the password will be the auto-generated password. Now, the client who wants to access the REST API has to use these credentials. This is the first way. Number 2. Providing the authentication details in application.properties. In this case, you can hardcode the username and password in application.properties. Whenever the user wants to access this application, he has to enter the username and password that is provided in application.properties. Okay. The third way is using in-memory authentication. In this case, the user credentials are provided programmatically in a Java configuration file. Now, if the user wants to access the application, he has to use the credentials that are available in Java configuration file. The first three ways, if you notice, they are used only for development purpose because in all the three cases, we are hard coding the user credentials. So it is used only for understanding Spring Security module and only for development purpose. The last three, whatever you are seeing, is really used in production ready application. First one, using JPA. In this case, the user credentials will be stored in the database. As in, if you are a new user entering into a website, it will ask you to add your credentials. You will be entering all your details by registering in the website. Now, your credentials are saved in the database. The next time when you are trying to log in, the application will authenticate you only if your username and password is correct. For this purpose, we will be working with the inbuilt classes and interfaces of Spring Security module. Rather than you sitting and writing boilerplate code, 90% of the code is taken care by Spring Framework. Only a part of the code you need to provide for saving the credentials of the user in the database. Okay. The next one is using OAuth2. OAuth2 is nowadays used by many applications. When you are trying to register yourself in a website, you might be getting multiple options. That is, you need to either provide a new username and password, or you can log in using Gmail, or you can log in using LinkedIn, or you can log in using Yahoo. So these kind of messages you may get whenever you are trying to access a website. So you can pick and choose any other resource to connect to this particular application. As in, I can use my Gmail credentials to get connected into Zomato, or I can use my Yahoo credentials to get connected to Myntra. So for this purpose, you need to understand OAuth2. OAuth2 authorization services help to authenticate a user using the credentials of other website. Okay. The last one is using JWT. JWT, JSON Web Tokens. This JWT, my dear guys, is used for authorizing an user in a web application. It is not for authenticating, it is for authorizing. Let me explain it with a simple example. Assume there is a front-end application where the user wants to register himself. So here we have the username, password, email, mobile number and so on. When the client clicks the submit button, a request goes from this front-end application to the back-end REST API. So remember, this is the back-end server. This is running in a different machine and this is running in a different machine, different port number. In this case, a request that comes in is /register. Because we are registering the user, the HTTP method that is used is post, and the data goes in the body part of the request. Once it reaches here, the server checks whether he is a new user or an existing user. If he is a new user, the data of this particular user will be saved in the database. This is the first flow. Now next, the same client now wants to log in. He has to enter his username and password and he clicks submit. This time also a request goes to the backend server. Assuming the URL is /login, the HTTP method is post. The username and password goes in the body part of this request. This time the server checks whether he is an authenticated user. My dear guys, till now we have not talked about JWT. So the authentication is already taken care by using JPA and the inbuilt classes of Spring Security. Once the server has completed the checks, checking for the username and password, if they are matching, then this time the server will generate a token, JWT, JSON Web Token, and the server will return the token as a response. So here the response contains the JWT token. Once the JWT token reaches the client machine, automatically it will be stored in the client's machine. How? Using local storage or session storage. So only for an authenticated user, a JWT token is getting generated. This is the second flow. Now let us talk about the third flow. That is the second request. First request is register. Second request is login. Now what about the third request? In this case, the user wants to see all the books by a particular author. Let us assume like this. Now a request again goes into the backend server. Maybe we can have it as /book/author /Kathy. This time, guys, please understand, together with the URL, the JWT token also is carried to the backend. This JWT token goes as a header in the request. In the backend, the server checks whether the JWT token is a valid JWT token, whether it is having the appropriate subject details, appropriate claims within the expiry date. It will check all these details. Based on that, it will allow that particular resource. So JWT token is used for authorizing a user, not for authenticating. Okay. This topic, my dear guys, is really very intense. So we will see it later on. As of now, we will be doing the basic authentication for our REST API. I hope, my dear guys, this is clear. These are different ways in which you can authenticate your REST API. What we will be seeing is the first two one. Even for in-memory authentication, you need to know the backend details of how Spring Security module is working. I am not going into that part, but of course I have added a video on that in my channel. If you are interested, you can go and watch that also. Now let me open Spring Tool Suite. Let us create a new Spring Starter project. Let me give the application name spring-boot-security basic. Type is Maven, packaging is jar. Let me give the group ID as com.greetapp.dist and package name as com.greetapp. Guys, this time we are not going to integrate our application with the database. This is a simple Spring REST API. So it is enough that I select Spring Web. Together with that, we need to select Spring Security module. Select Spring Security, click Next, click Finish. Let me open the application. In pom.xml, we have added just two dependencies. One is Spring Web, the other one is Spring Security. Open src main Java, select the package and let us create a controller. Right click, new class. Package name is com.greetapp.controllers. Class name is greet controller. Okay. Now let us annotate this class with @rest controller. Now let me add just two methods. Public string greet message. Let it take a parameter string username. Return grade day plus username. And let me annotate it with @getMapping /greet/username. Let us use path variable. Okay. Let me add one more method. Public list of string show books. Return list.of add few book names. Annotate this method also using @getMapping and pass the URL /show-books. Okay. Now our controller class is ready. Without doing any other modification, let us run this application. As I told you, because we are not providing any authentication specific configuration, Spring Boot or Spring Security module will automatically create a username with the name user and generate a password for us. Let us check it out. Select the application, right click, run as Spring Boot app. Click OK. Now guys, see here, Spring Boot has automatically generated a password for us. So let me copy this. Let me scroll down. In the bottom you can see the default configuration that is provided by Spring Boot because we have not provided our authentication details. This is all good. What will happen when I run this particular application in the browser? Automatically it will open a form. It will expect you to provide a username and password. The username is user, the password is auto-generated password. My dear guys, we don't have any website. We are not providing a form for the user to enter the user details. But because we have added Spring Security module, by default, Spring Security module will create a login page which has username and password. Together with that, it will also create a logout page just to log out the user. Let us check it out. Let me open the browser. Localhost :8080/greet/priya. Enter. Now automatically a form is opened. See the URL, it is /login. This page is by default created by Spring Security module. It is also providing us the username as user and the password as auto-generated password. Let me paste it. Click sign in. Now here I am getting the output. Great day Priya. What if I want to log out of this? I can give it as 8080/logout. I'll get a logout button. Let me click on this. Fine. Now let me try to give the other URL /show-books. Let me press enter. Again it will take me to the login page because you have logged out of that application. So every time you are trying to access a page in a particular application, it is mandatory that you should be a logged in user, or else it will ask you to log in before accessing the resource. It is as simple as that. When you are entering into a website, only if you are a logged in user, you can access the resources. If you log out of it, it will again ask you to log in to access those resources. Correct? Same way. Now here let me type it out. Username is user, password is the auto-generated password. Let me click sign in. Now here we have got the output. See again, from here only, let me add /greet/priya. Enter. Because I am a logged in user, I am allowed to access the other resources also. So this is a very basic authentication. Let us also try one more thing. Guys, always remember one thing. After crossing all the filters, the request will automatically go and hit the dispatcher servlet only. From the dispatcher servlet only, it is going to the appropriate controller class. That is the controller class that we have written. Okay. Now this time, let us go and add the username and password in application.properties file. You can do it in an YAML file also. So let me just type .security. See, automatically you will get user.name and user.password. Let me give it as Priya security user.password. Let me give the password as Priya123. Saving this, relaunch the application. Let me maximize the console. This time if you notice, the password is not auto-generated. Why? Because as a developer, you have provided the credentials for the user. Now let me go to the browser. Let me press enter. The username is Priya. Password is Priya123. Here I have got the output. Okay. Again, if I want to log out, I can go and change the URL to /logout. A logout button will come, which will allow me to log out of this particular application. Okay. How to test the same application using Postman? Now here, let me go and change the URL to /greet/Priya. Now go to authorization. Pull this down. Type basic R. It will ask you to enter the username and password. This case, it is Priya and Priya123. After adding the credentials, click send. Here you should get the output. So if you are using Postman, go to the tab authorization and provide the authentication based on what you are working with. If you are working with OAuth specific authentication, you need to choose this. If you are working with JWT specific authorization, you need to select this bearer token or JWT bearer. Okay. Provide the credentials of the user and click send. Then automatically you will get the output. For the second URL also you should get it, show-books. Here I have got the output. So guys, I hope this is clear. We have just seen a very simple example of authenticating our Spring REST API using the basic authentication method. Not only that, we have also learned about the key terms that are used in Spring Security and about Spring Security architecture. Guys, Spring Security module does not end here. There are much more advanced concepts in this. That is, you need to learn how to authenticate your application using JPA together with the inbuilt classes and interfaces of Spring Security module. As in, you will be creating a Java configuration file. You will be adding authentication bean, authorization bean, password encoder, and that one is completely intense. We are not going to touch that part. We have learned how a Spring REST API application can be authenticated. But guys, I have given videos of how to authenticate a Spring application using JPA and the inbuilt classes of Spring Security module in my channel. Maybe I will give the link above over here. You can watch that out. The last video what we are going to see is how to containerize our Spring REST API using Docker. So stay tuned. After completing this particular video, please share your feedback in the comments. Let us learn, code and grow together. Thank you.